And today we're going to conclude the Weldon-Angelos Justice Act with Section 153, repeal of mandatory minimums. And that's pretty self-explanatory. So we're going to talk about I want to talk about the history of mandatory minimums, some of the theory, and then what this does specifically. In 2016, more than 55% of the federal prison population had been sentenced under a mandatory minimum provision, carrying an average sentence length of 110 months. Now, we talk about them these days. They escalated as part of the war on drugs, but mandatory minimums have been around since the beginning of America. The first 1790 crime bill that Congress passed, it had 23 crimes, and 7 of them had a mandatory death penalty. The rest of them just had maximum sentences. But punishment was different in the 18th century. There was less incarceration. Jails were more to hold people before trial and then hand down punishment. So mandatory minimums, have been around for hundreds of years. When Congress abolished the slave trade, they added some more mandatory minimums. You could get 5 years for bringing slaves into the United States, or 2 years for serving on a vessel that was doing that. And sort of like the drug war today, smugglers, there was this cat and mouse game. And so then they had mandatory minimums for just outfitting a ship for slave trafficking and things like that. It was kind of so the use of mandatory minimums increased in the last half of the 20th century after World War II. And the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1896, it really created the framework for a lot of the mandatory minimums that we have today. Now, the premier organization that's working on this issue is FAM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. They've been around for more than 30 years. They were founded by a woman whose brother got a 5-year mandatory minimum for growing marijuana in Washington State. And the judge told her brother, hey, I'm sorry, that's the law. This is what I have to sentence you to. And so she started an organization to end the practice of mandatory minimums and work on other sentencing reform. And so I'd like to share some of their arguments about why the practice of mandatory minimums should be repealed. One of them is the theories, right? The theory is that mandatory minimums deter crime and make the public safer. But if you think about that, like, deterrence assumes that people are going to research the criminal code, that they're going to find what the relevant mandatory penalty is and then be discouraged. It'd be like, oh, it's a 10-year mandatory minimum. Well, it was 5 years, then I would commit this crime, but 10 years is too much. People don't know generally what the mandatory minimums are for crimes. And so increasing the penalty and making it more severe doesn't work as a deterrent. People don't commit crimes expecting to get caught. So what does deter them, though, is catching them and serving justice quickly, not just long sentences. One of the other theories is that mandatory minimums will create consistency or uniformity in sentencing. And that's sort of one of the reasons that they came about, was that you might hear about somebody who got off with not enough prison time. And so the idea was, well, if we set a mandatory minimum, then everyone will have to get this much prison time. And so that'll be more fair. But as a practical matter, it doesn't really work that way, because prosecutors are the ones who decide when, where, and how to charge people. And so prosecutors have enormous leverage in using mandatory minimums at different rates to create sentencing disparities and inconsistencies. In fact, mandatory minimums create racial disparities in sentencing. There's a study of federal sentencing patterns that showed that Black people were more likely than their white counterparts to be charged and convicted of mandatory sentences. To a 2014 University of Michigan study, researchers found that federal prosecutors were 65% more likely to charge Black defendants. One example would be drug-free school zones, which often require mandatory prison terms for buying or selling drugs within a certain distance of a school. When I lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, and served in the legislature there, there were a half a dozen schools in my district. It was a very population dense area. whereas other representatives, representative places with very low population density. And in high population density area, you're more likely to find people of color. And so they get the hardest hit by these harsh drug-free school zone laws. In New Jersey, before they reformed their mandatory minimums in 2010, Black and Hispanic people made up 96% of the people convicted and incarcerated under the drug-free zone laws. A couple other theories is that mandatory minimum sentences are necessary to ensure sufficient punishment. Mandatory minimums are just a minimum. There are still maximum penalties in the criminal code. So judges can ensure sufficient punishment however they think is appropriate. So eliminating mandatory minimums doesn't mean that people aren't going to be punished or imprisoned. It just means that the courts won't have to do it indiscriminately without considering the factors that matter. And last, mandatory minimum sentences require courts to send people to prison, even if prison is unnecessary to keep the public safe, or they require keeping people in prison past the point at which they pose a danger to others. This is not justice. The name of this section is the Weldon-Angelos Justice Act. Again, he was a man who was sentenced to 55 years on mandatory minimums for selling drugs in a school zone. And the judge, apologized to him and said, my hands are tied. There's nothing I can do about it. This is not a fair sentence, but this is what the law says. And if the law requires us to hand down injustice, then the law is wrong and it should be changed. And so that's what Section 153 will do. It will repeal all the mandatory minimums from the United States Code and let judges judge. Now, a lot of mandatory minimums that are already on the books fall under the drug war. And so those laws have already been wiped away by the first part of the Weldon-Angelos Justice Act. But there are 66 other mandatory minimums that exist. And so I did a quick breakdown just to see what the sentences are. Out of those 66, 14 of them have mandatory minimums that are under 1 year. 13 are for mandatory minimums between 1 and 4 years. 8 are between 5 and 9 years. 8 are between 10 and 14 years. 7 of them are for a specific term of years longer than 15. And 16 of these mandatory minimums are a mandatory life imprisonment. Again, this section doesn't reduce the maximum penalty. Even if it doesn't reduce the maximum penalty, it just gets rid of the minimum so that judges are able to take facts into consideration and make an appropriate decision. Some of these, though, are, they're old. Let me share the screen here. Piracy. So if you are engaged in a piratical cruise or enterprise, or you're part of the crew and you commit robbery on shore, you shall be imprisoned for life. If you willfully obstruct the escape of any person trying to save their life from a shipwrecked vessel, you can be imprisoned for not less than 10 years. If you're a seaman on a ship and you lay violent hands on your commander to hinder or prevent his fighting in defense of his vessel or the goods entrusted him, you're subject to imprisonment for life. These are some of the mandatory minimums that exist today. And this is not an endorsement of piracy to repeal these, but to say that judges should be able to judge. There are some serious crimes here. And again, this doesn't change the maximum sentences. It just gets rid of the minimums. Now, the states have taken the lead over the last couple decades. Over 30 states have reformed or repealed their own mandatory minimum sentences. And so we can kind of get an idea of what the results would be. 2017, Louisiana repealed many of its mandatory minimums, and in the first 6 months alone, the state saved $12 million. The state's prison population dropped to a level not seen since the 90s. And then the state was able to reinvest that savings, the money that they'd already had earmarked for incarceration, and put it back into crime reduction and victim support programs. Pennsylvania, in 2015, many of their mandatory minimums were struck down as being unconstitutional. And since that ruling, crime rates have continued to decline, and the state's prison population has continued to decline. And in 2002, Michigan legislators repealed almost all mandatory drug sentences, and the state's crime rate dropped 25% in the decade following their reform. So mandatory minimums do not serve the purpose that we like to think that they do, other than allowing politicians to get tough on crime. But that's not their constitutional duty to get tough on crime. Their duty is to establish justice. And so we can do that best by repealing mandatory minimums. And with that, Mixed Chair, I think that concludes my testimony on this section, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes. Do other countries use mandatory minimums?
They do. Obviously, the United States is the world leader in incarceration, with about 5% of the world's population and more than 20% of the prison population. But some courts in other countries have found mandatory minimums to be unconstitutional. For example, Canada, India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Papua New Guinea. I think it's also important to recognize that other countries don't issue such harsh sentences overall the way that the United States does. So in 2016, there were more than 200,000 people in the United States serving a life sentence or life without parole, compared to the United Kingdom, where there was a total of 50 serving life without parole. And so there's just a huge disparity there.